whatever we learned about love and parenting and communication and pretty much most of the human behaviors, we would have learned them so early on that we don't even think that that's what we believe.
Have you ever found yourself reacting in a way that catches you off guard? Maybe shutting down in an argument, feeling unheard in your relationship, or struggling to express what you need. Often these patterns aren't just random. They don't come out of nowhere. They are shaped by our past experiences, even the ones we can't consciously remember. Welcome to This Complex Life. I'm your host, Marie Vakakis, and this is another episode in a series all around relationships and couples and all that stuff. And today I'm joined by Tracy, a psychotherapist who helps people recognize and shift these deep-seated patterns. She shares her own journey into therapy, how she found herself working with couples, and why self-awareness is at the heart of meaningful change. If you've ever wondered, why do I react this way? Or why does my partner not seem to understand me? Then this episode's for you. And to have this conversation, I have with me Tracy. Welcome to the podcast, Tracy.
Oh, thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here.
I love hearing about the unexpected ways that people find their way into this work. You're so passionate about what you do. That's very clear in the interactions we've had prior to setting this episode up. But is there a particular moment, or was there a particular moment or experience that made you realize, yep, this is what I want to do. This is the job, the career, the vocation for me?
Yes. So I always say long story short, but then give a long story. So we'll see where we go with it. Look, I guess broader in terms of how I've ended up as a psychotherapist. From my childhood, we had a lot of people around us, a lot of services that supported us. I had a lot of trauma in my childhood and poverty and those types of things. And so I was so lucky that we had access to services and beautiful humans who helped me and different members of my families in different ways. And without knowing any of the language around it, I knew I wanted to be in that type of role. Working with people when they're at the most vulnerable, particularly when people are marginalized. It's not that I don't want to work with people who aren't marginalized, but it's kind of like a sliding scale of, well, if you don't have a voice, then I'm drawn to wanting to help. I remember saying to someone when I was 18, oh, I want to be a counselor, but I didn't know what that word meant. I ended up working in lots of roles that supported my desire to work with people. And when I was pregnant with my last child, who's now 11, that's when I became a therapist, finally kind of realized I could do it. Even how I became a psychotherapist, I didn't know that's what I was. I didn't know what one was. I just really liked the woman I was talking to on the phone at Metavision. And I'm like, well, I'll choose this course then. So that's how I became a therapist. And I never dreamed I would work with couples. It was never where I wanted to go. I always thought I'd work with addiction because addiction impacted my life a lot when I was younger. So I was always feeling like that's where I was going to go. And the universe sent me, and we have full permission to speak about this from my client. My second ever client was gender diverse. But at that time, there was no language around it. They didn't know how to talk about it. I didn't know how to talk about it. I tried to get some training, couldn't get any training. And the lack of education and information for me as a therapist out there to be able to upskill, to be able to make sure I was working in an affirming way with this person. So my second ever client that I worked with took me on a journey of learning more about gender diversity. And that's where my, I guess, passion and dedication to having more affirming practices around diversity generally came from. And it was the same with couples work. It was, and I say couples work, and I just want to, kind of put a disclaimer there that when I say that, I mean relationship work. Not everyone is in a couple. Some people are in different types of relationships, but for purposes of ease for the podcast, I'll say couples when I mean relationships, and they might be made up of more than two people. But with relationship work, I was adamant I was never going to work in that space. I think I was just like, that's too many people to work with. That's too many people. Until a a supervisor of mine said, when are you going to stop sending me these referrals and start working with relationships yourself? And I was like, okay, maybe I'll get some education and qualifications around that then. So that's how I've ended up here. So short story long.
As you were talking about all of those things, I was sitting there nodding, thinking the benefit and ability to work with couples and with families is like early intervention and prevention for future generations. And kind of, I can relate, having studied to work with young people, with adolescents, and then moved into family therapy. If people have listened to the podcast before, they'll know I've spoken about this, where I found the sweet spot of working with teens and was like, yep, great, got this. And then I'm like, oh my God, they come with parents and I don't know what to do with parents. Other than give them an informative brochure, it's like, I don't know what to do with you. I didn't know how to handle multiple people in the room. So I went and did what I love to do, study, and did a family therapy degree. And then in that I thought, well, I really love couples work. So then I went, did the Gottman training, and now I'm on the certification track. And as you're talking, I kind of hear that same desire, that appreciation for the ripple effect of this work, that you're not only helping people heal in that relationship, it's the impact it can have for everybody else. So they heal not just for themselves, but their entire families and future generations and their community. So what is it about this work that feels so important to you?
Yeah, it's the driving force in terms of trying to be able to support people either when they already have dependence or if they're thinking of having dependence, to heal prior to us working with them as adults, healing from what happened with their parents. So yeah, I think whenever I kind of feel like, oh, maybe I'll go back to individuals, or maybe I won't do couples anymore, or I kind of remember the deep feeling that the work that I'm doing and the work that these people are coming to me to do is so important and kind of life-changing for not just them, but for literally then everyone who will be in their attachment circles. And so I just feel like it kind of flows on so much that it's so meaningful. I mean, I'm sure you'll have worked with individuals before, and sometimes you're like, oh, if I could just get the other people in the room too, because it's never one person. No one is an island.
I really love that saying, that no one is an island. And I think sometimes with individual work, and I've done a lot of this myself, we focus on just that person. We hear one side of the story. We might even pathologize very natural, normal, even potentially healthy responses to adverse experiences and negative life events and abhorrent situations. So there can be a lot of missed opportunity for changing the system just by trying to focus on one person. If we look at couples with children in particular, because we're looking at sort of that intergenerational, I guess, support and healing, what are some of the things that happen in couples therapy that actually benefit the next generation? What do you observe, or what do you see?
I think when it comes to the relationship and the primary couple, whatever you learned growing up, we can have an idea about what we logically believe. Like, oh, I don't believe that this is the right thing to do, or this is the right thing to do. But then we go and do it because we're programmed, Whatever we learned about love and parenting and communication and pretty much most of the human behaviors, we would have learned them so early on that we don't even think that that's what we believe. It's kind of like, sometimes when I'm working with a couple, it's eye-opening to watch them realizing that they act like they believe that, because they're like, no, I believe that, I don't know, that you shouldn't hit your kids, or you shouldn't shout at your kids, or whatever it is. They'll have that belief, but then their actions will speak differently, because what we know, what you and I would know, and what most people who work with mental health and attachment and relationships would know, is that that blueprint was created a long, long time ago. And whilst we're never going to be able to change what our experiences were as a child, we can become really aware of what our beliefs are and where they come from. So it's like, am I acting in accordance with what I actually believe, or am I reacting to what I saw growing up, or am I reacting to what I learned love looks like, or learned parenting looks like? And so I think it can show up in lots of different ways. But the key for me, I think, is about people becoming really aware of themselves. The more aware, I mean, you and I have spoken about this previously, you know, I come from a trauma background, and I still will revert back to my kind of self-sabotaging ways sometimes, or my old belief systems. But because I'm so aware of them, in the moment, I can usually catch myself and realize that I'm behaving in a way that I don't want to behave in. But for the majority of people, that's a big discovery journey. That's a long-term discovery journey. And you don't just kind of go, oh, my partner said that I do this, I'll stop it. You know, because it's there for a reason. It protected us at some point, or it worked well for us at some point. So I think our experiences as children show up in our relationships all the time, and it comes down to how self-aware we can be. And then it comes down to how we can be communicating that with our partner so that they learn, you know, when I do this, you know, when I scream at you for doing ABC and you don't seem to understand why it's important, it's because of this. And then you're letting them know that your response isn't always about them. And you're also kind of giving them some insight so they can have a bit of empathy maybe, rather than getting really pissed off back at you, you know? So that's when it comes to the relationship. But when it comes to parenting, you said something before that really struck a chord with me about how, and not everyone is a parent, but for those who are, having kids and having any kind of trauma background, particularly if it's not processed or you're not aware of it, or even if you are going to get triggered by your children whenever they are reminding you or kind of bringing up memories for you or bringing up experiences for you that whether you found them traumatic or whether you received the same thing they're receiving or didn't receive what they're receiving. So I think being aware of that is something that I would say is really common when I'm working with couples who are parents. Is pretty much 90% of the time we are going to be working through some of the challenges they're facing as parents, and it will be related to the fact that in those moments they are being transported back without necessarily consciously knowing that to the things that happened for them as children that are impacting the way that they are connecting or responding to their kid or to their partner around parenting.
Well, we could really talk about that for ages. There is so much that gets overt for us and that we keep tripping over as adults that is stuff from our childhood or from past experiences. And so much of what we expect in relationships, whether it's being shown love through words or gestures or quality time, comes from what we learned growing up. And sometimes we don't even realize that we're operating from those patterns. Like you've said, some of it is things that we feel is implied or we've picked up along the way through observing our parents, a whole bunch of stuff. And one of the common struggles, and I'm sure I'm not alone when I say this, but I see people come to therapy with the expectation that our partner should just know what we want without us having to ask. And I definitely have been in that position as well, being like, why can't you just read my mind and know what I want in this situation? But when that doesn't happen, it could lead to frustration. And so this is a real challenge for couples, these ideas of unspoken expectations, those little things we just assume our partner should just know without us having to say to them. And then if they don't know, we attribute a meaning to that if they don't know, then they don't love us or they don't care. So for example, maybe it's bringing you your favorite snack if they go to the supermarket, or giving you a hug in the right moment, or remembering an important date. You know, the snack one is a good example. It's like, do you need anything from the shops? No, I'm fine. But then they come back empty-handed. It's like, but I wanted chocolate. It's like, well, then why did you ask for chocolate? It's like, well, I wanted you to know that that's what I wanted and to see it on sale or see it there and think, oh, Maria would really like that chocolate, but I don't want to have to ask you to get it for me because then it's not you thinking of me. And it's so messy, right? Like, why do so many people struggle with this idea of asking for what they need? And how does this play out in the way couples communicate?
But then you're like, no, I wanted you to get me the chocolates without me asking for the chocolates. Such a common thing that comes up. And, you know, I guess let's use the chocolates as the example. So in session, when those types of comments are shared or those types of needs are shared. I need to be cuddled for me to feel loved. I need to be told what you like about me for me to feel loved. Or I need to be taken out on Valentine's Day to feel loved. What I will hear so much of the time, and I will tend to disappoint my clients with my responses, is, but I want them to want to know. And I don't want to have to ask. And I say to them, that's all well and good. Go watch a rom-com. Because honestly, the quickest way to be misunderstood is to not express yourself. So yes, we can understand that for some people, expressing their need in and of itself is their response to what they've learned as a child. But once we are aware of that, like if you can be saying to yourself, I know that I find it really difficult to be honest with my partner about exactly what I need, then that's something that I'd be saying to someone, you're going to want to look at that. And let me put a disclaimer in here that everything we're talking about today is around healthy, non-abusive relationships. So obviously, if you are in an abusive relationship, then this conversation, these kind of strategies and tools we're discussing aren't going to be relevant. But if you are in a relationship that is healthy, then if you can't talk to that person about something you need, what that does not signify is that you're not loved. It doesn't also signify that you're crap at communication. It signifies that there is a block somewhere that stops you being able to do that. And whether you want to meditate on that, read a book, see a therapist, just sometimes being aware of it can be enough. Sometimes just realizing, do you know what? I always struggle with that can be enough to make a little bit of a change. That's where the problem stems from, I see. It's more that if we are expecting our partner to guess our needs, we are going to be sorely disappointed the majority of the time.
So we both kind of see similar things in our work where we have a hope, a dream, an expectation that maybe we don't vocalize. And we think it should be implied that someone should just know, right? Like if they loved us, why wouldn't they do X, Y, Z or, do a surprise for us? And it's tricky because I know I talk to couples about this, even in clients in individual therapy, and they're like, oh, but I would do this for them. And it reminds me of when we're little and we have this, the golden rule of don't do for someone else what you would want done to you. But in relationships, it's do for them what they would like done for them. So if you love birthday parties and surprise parties and you're like, I want a surprise party so bad and I love these and I'll organize them for my friends or let's say for my partner, and your partner really doesn't like to celebrate their birthday in that way and they rock up to this party and they feel blindsided or overwhelmed and you're sitting there thinking, how ungrateful. I put in all this effort and they don't like it. And then for your party, they do something low key and maybe book a restaurant and you're like going to the restaurant thinking, oh, maybe this is the surprise. And they're like, it's just us. And then you are deflated. And so we often find ourselves doing for someone else what we would want done for us, or we just don't pick up those subtle kind of social cues or little hints without being explicit. And I think that can be really painful. And so I guess it comes to the next kind of thing I want to talk about is so much of conflict in a relationship is not about the thing that it's about, right? It's often a deeper meaning behind it. It's not that you forgot the chocolate. It's not that you didn't organize a surprise party. Whether it's wanting a gift or more intimacy or a certain type of affection, there's a need that's behind some of these things that helps us feel loved and valued. And when couples can struggle to communicate those needs, it leads to things like resentment and misunderstanding, or feeling like our partner just doesn't get it. So how do we help couples move beyond those surface level niggly bits and those frustrations and get to those deeper conversations about what these things, about what their needs really are and what they mean?
I very rarely would work with a couple who've got all of that sorted out. It comes down to so many things. Obviously, communication's a big one there. It's finding healthy ways of being able to talk about what your needs are, what needs are currently being met, what needs aren't being met, and which ones are non-negotiables for you. And then it's about trying to give them the space to hear that, empathize with it, and then also share with you. And, we all take everything personally. That's just the way most of us will, we hear someone say something straight away. We're like, what does that mean about me, to me, for me? It's human to do that. And so it's a bit of a learning curve. And when I'm working with couples, that's one of the very, very first things we have to learn to do is how to communicate in such a way that you're listening to someone without judgment, even though what they're talking about probably really impacts you and might even feel like it's in some way an attack on you. So how we would work with that particular scenario would be first learning how to have a conversation and hear your partner without taking it personally. And you've touched on a few of the kind of Gottman trainings previously, which is a modality I'm trained in. And, they talk about the 4 horsemen. So if you're communicating with your partner and you are using any of the 4 horsemen, it's unlikely the communication is going to go well. It's unlikely you're going to get to a healthy outcome of that conversation. But if you can be aware of that and make sure that you're not criticizing, you're not being contemptuous towards your partner, you're not defending every single thing they say, and you're not stonewalling them by pushing them away or disappearing, then I would want my couples to get to a place where they can hold that space for each other and have a healthy conversation about things that might still make them feel sad. It might feel sad for you to hear from your partner that they would love you to want sex with them more, but your sex drive for whatever reason or your desire to have sex with them is lower. That can be really hard to hear. But I would be working with my couples to get them to a place of understanding that being in a relationship doesn't mean we have the same needs, doesn't mean we have the same communication styles, doesn't mean we have the same beliefs even, Where you want to get to is a place where you can have conversations about those things and make sure that you're aware of the things that are non-negotiable for each other. So if it's non-negotiable for you to never have a gift, if your partner says, I'm never going to, it's just something fundamentally that I feel strongly about, I'm never going to give you a gift. You then get to decide, well, I don't think I can be in a relationship with someone like that then. What is not helpful is what we often see, which is, you're crap because you don't get me gifts, because then it's that. So I'd be working with a couple to kind of understand the consequences of that. It's like, well, if we're using your analogy of the chocolate almonds or my analogy of the sex, if you're having a conversation with your partner and saying, this is super important to me, and your partner says, I know, but I can't give it, that's one thing. If you're saying to your partner, this is super important to me, and they're saying, I get that, but I don't want to give it, there are 2 different things for them to be saying. Everyone gets a choice then to decide whether they want that in their relationship. Because there is no magic way to get it to the point where you both want the same things, you both feel loved in the same ways, and you both deliver on that. There's a commonly held belief, which I try to stay away from gendering things, but I think there's a commonly held belief amongst people that men always want sex and women don't want it. And where do non-binary people fit in that? Who knows where they're put on that spectrum of wanting and not wanting, because we don't talk about it enough. But I would completely disagree with that. I would say absolutely I do see a correlation in the fact that often there will be, if I'm working with a heterosexual cis couple, there is more often than not the person who wants more physical intimacy and sex is the man, and more often than not the person who wants something else first or not the physical intimacy is the woman. So we'll go with that one just because it's the most common. And people will often feel like that's got to be a deal breaker then. If my partner wants sex 3 times a week, and I know when I say that, everyone's like, all right, okay, so it's 3 times the week, the average, because there isn't one. There's no real normal. But, if your partner says, I want sex this many times for me to feel loved, and the other person says, that's just not something I can do, then you have to have conversations about what that's going to mean long term for you. But what I'd also be encouraging people to do is going underneath that and saying, well, when you get the chocolate covered almonds or when you get the sex, what does it mean to you? How does that make you feel? What do you feel I'm saying when I do that? Because then sometimes we can be meeting that person's need in a way that more aligns with what we can offer. But you're right, so often we'll get very, very stuck on the surface level of, you didn't buy me any nuts when you went out and I always buy you nuts. And that means I love you more. And what are we going to do about that?
Yeah, there's so much in what you're saying that we could unpack any one of those topics, but we're talking about people that are struggling to sometimes express their needs in relationships, whether that's wanting affection, reassurance, feeling valued. And that can be in a number of different ways through gifts, quality time, acts of service. Like, we're not going to go into the 5 love languages, but the thing is, instead of communicating them directly, they hope their partner will just know. And that, as we can see, leads to frustration and resentment. And you also mentioned that sometimes a need isn't just a preference, it can be a deal breaker. And you used the example around sex, and these conversations do come up a lot around intimacy. And if someone needs sex to feel loved, the context around it can really matter. Are they feeling emotionally connected? Do they feel desired outside of the bedroom? And on the other side, if someone doesn't want sex as often, what's happening for them? Is it stress? Is it exhaustion? Is there something deeper about how they're experiencing intimacy? And without having those conversations, it really puts people in a position to feel, rejected, unloved, dissatisfied in the relationship. And so if it's already hard to talk about something like, you didn't get me chocolates, or this thing that I've wanted, or help me in this way, in things that are outside the bedroom, I think when it comes to sex, it's so much harder to talk about. And it's not a need, like, we're not going to die without it. The human race might, but we're very, very far from that. And I encourage a lot of the couples I work with to have a think about, what does sex mean to them? How does it help them feel connected? What would they like from their partner? How do they, do they have these myths around it being spontaneous all the time? How do they really connect? Are there other ways that they connect? How do they go about initiating, or are they hoping their partner will, or are they kind of hinting and being kind of like smart-assy or petulant, because no one wants that? So how do you help couples talk about sex and intimacy?
When I try and talk to couples about sex and intimacy, I say, intimacy isn't sex. Intimacy is being exposed and vulnerable. And so when couples come to see me, if sex is one of the things they want to talk about, I will regularly tell them that that's going to be what we are discussing once we've been in therapy for a while. Because if you're not communicating well, if you're fighting a lot, if you're feeling disconnected, or if you've got unresolved personal situations that are happening for you, then diving into something that, for the most part, involves you being completely vulnerable and exposed, all you're going to get is shut down. So we can't have conversations about sex and intimacy unless we feel completely safe to even acknowledge what we want ourselves.
One of the things I sometimes tell people, if you're not able to talk about sex, then you probably shouldn't be having it. And I think we do ourselves a really big disservice in sexual health education and sex ed, because while we're getting better at public health messages around safety, in particular the transmission of STDs, there's talk about consent and saying no and how to say no, but we don't talk about pleasure and what feels good. And how are you supposed to say no to what you don't want if you don't even know what you want? So there's a whole bit there. But what do you think about this idea? If you can't talk about it, you probably shouldn't do it. Like, if you need to get drunk or be substance affected in order to have sex, like that, I see that as really alarming.
Don't think many people would be having sex then. Yeah, totally. I would say that the majority, again, not being a sexologist or sex therapist, the majority of issues that are brought to me in the therapy room around sex are more around that type of situation. We've never communicated about it. We don't know how to communicate about it, and we weren't taught how to. And, I describe myself as really sex positive, and my children are being raised in a sex positive house. And what that means is we don't treat sex as a secret thing or a bad thing. but we talk about it in a very age appropriate way. And we talk about it in a very factual way. And, to the point where my kids now just roll their eyes and leave the table if I start on one of my rants. And I think when you say, if you can't talk about it, don't be having it. What I would say about that is, if you can't talk about it, you're unlikely to be having a satisfied, healthy sex life. That's what I'd say. If I used to probably have way more sex than I do now. But I definitely wasn't having that in a necessarily healthy way for myself. And the older I've gotten and the more work I do in this space, even down to sexuality, like I identify as a queer woman. Now, I've only been able to say that probably for about 3 or 4 years. Prior to that, my story was always, I was a lesbian and now I'm straight. Because I didn't know any other ways to describe that. And what my experience of kind of being part of and working with the queer community is that if you've had to question your sexuality, then you are much more likely to be open talking about it. And that is not to say if you're queer, you're probably really, comfortable talking about sex. But what it does show me is a clear correlation between people who are comfortable to have open, honest conversations about anything that relates to their own sexuality are much more likely to be in satisfying sexual relationships, or not if they are asexual. Even understanding that that's a thing, like, some people are asexual. And if you know what that means to you and you can have conversations with your partners about it, then they get to decide if they want to be in a relationship with someone who's identifying as asexual, someone who can't offer them a particular thing.
The theme that's coming through in all of these little bits and pieces we've been talking about is the ability to have open, honest conversations. And some people aren't ready to have that yet. So if you're listening and that's you, maybe that's where some individual work can be really helpful, is to have a think about what's blocking even sometimes the self-reflection, and then trying to get your kind of thoughts in order, like, get that draft. And I love that Brene Brown uses this idea of the shitty first draft, like just kind of, sometimes if you just give your partner the first draft and they don't know what to make of it, and maybe you're already struggling with communication, it's probably going to go pear-shaped. So there are heaps of books and resources and things that you can find and look for. And there's one book that I like to recommend called Growing Yourself Up by Jenny Brown. And I interviewed Jenny about this on the podcast, so I'll pop a link to that in the show notes. And there's heaps of couples therapy books. So the Gottmans have a whole bunch of really good books. I'm just looking on my bookshelf now, and I've got The Relationship Cure, What Makes Love Last, The Power of Attachment, actually, by Diane Paul Hello is really good. There's one called The Man's Guide to Women, which is next on my list. I haven't actually read it yet. But are there any books that you can recommend?
I am terrible with remembering anything. I love everything Esther Perel talks about. We're not completely aligned, but, Esther Perel does great podcasts, and a lot of her conversations are about intimacy and sex. So that's kind of, probably the only name I ever remember. And again, I think it would depend on, like, for you, I love the work you're doing with young people, because again, it's like, this is where we catch them, this is where we can help them understand. And I know that there's books out about consent. Or is it Yuki?
Yumi Steins and Melissa Kang.
Yes, Yumi. Okay. I know I got that one for my kids. And again, they were like, oh, here she goes again. Talking about sex and gender and but yes, I can definitely offer some recommendations, but not on the spot.
Thank you so much for such an interesting conversation. We started off thinking about the impact of early childhood experiences and trauma, and we went into having tough conversations and sex and intimacy, and the theme keeps coming up around talking about things, being upfront and honest and communicating. And I think that's such an important bit. A lot of the work we do, a lot of the work I know I do in couples therapy, and I'm sure you do as well, is helping people have those tough conversations. And therapy is just one avenue. There's lots of stuff out there, a lot of resources, but putting your head in the sand is probably not going to be the most helpful thing. So thank you so much for contributing to this series all around intimate relationships and couples. And it's been an absolute pleasure, and maybe we'll get you back on the podcast again soon.
Yeah, I loved talking to you, and I'm a chatterbox, so apologies if I ran over on some of the points.
What a rich and insightful conversation with Tracy. We started off by looking at how past experiences shape our relationships and explored some of the deeper challenges around communication, intimacy, and unspoken expectations. And I don't know about you, but it's really hard, and I still sometimes secretly hope my partner will bring me the favourite chocolates. Not the box of favourites, but my favourite chocolate without me having to say something. Actually, probably the salted macadamia nuts, chocolate-covered macadamia nuts, dark chocolate ones. Delicious. Anyway, one thing that kept coming up was the power of open, honest conversations, and whether it's expressing what we need, which we know is super vulnerable and it's really hard to do, addressing relationship challenges, or even talking about intimacy, avoiding these conversations, it really helps. And therapy is just one way to work through those things. But as Tracy said, there are so many tools, books, resources, podcasts. She mentioned Esther Perel's podcast, which is called Where Should We Begin? And that's a really great one. And Esther Perel also has a couple of online courses as well, which you can look at. There are so many things out there, but find your information from reputable sources. So you want to find people who work with couples, who work with families, who have a background and skills and expertise in that, because just random advice, if it feels too simple or too good to be true, is probably not going to work. But anyway, I digress. If this episode resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Send me a message or share it with someone who might find it helpful. And if you're looking for more on relationships and mental health, then make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Thanks for listening to This Complex Life, and I will see you next time. Thank you for listening. To keep the conversation going, head on over to Instagram or LinkedIn and follow me. If you'd like to keep updated with episodes and other interesting things happening in mental health, join my weekly This Complex Life newsletter, where I'll share tools, tips and insight. There's a link in the show notes. Got a question you want answered? Shoot me an email or a DM. I'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoy the show, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a rating and a review. It helps other people find the podcast.